I never thought loneliness could be so loud. But some nights, the silence in my Brooklyn apartment screams louder than any crowd ever did. Just last week, my daughter told me, "Mom, we think it's best if you move to a nursing home. Less stress for all of us." Those words cut deeper than the winter cold that seeps through my thin curtains. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Helen, and at 74, I thought I had seen it all. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered when I checked my daughter's phone records. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about the people I had devoted my entire life to protecting and loving. Every morning starts the same way in my small apartment on Fifth Avenue in Park Slope. I blink open my tired eyes to the muted hum of city life filtering through the cracked window. The faint smell of burnt coffee from Rosario's cafe downstairs drifts up through the thin walls, mixing with the musty scent of old books and memories that fill every corner of this place I've called home for 37 years. I shuffle to the tiny kitchen, my slippers making soft sounds against the worn linoleum floor. The coffee maker gurgles to life, and I stand there waiting, watching the dark liquid drip slowly into the pot. This ritual gives me a few moments of peace before the weight of another day settles on my shoulders. The weight of being forgotten, of being seen as a burden rather than the woman who once held this family together with nothing but love and determination. I sip my coffee alone at the small round table by the window, the same table where I once helped my children with homework, where I balanced checkbooks and worried about paying rent. The morning light filters through the dusty glass, casting long shadows across the yellow walls that haven't been painted in over a decade. I keep reaching for my phone, hoping for a message, a call, a simple good morning from one of my 3 children. But the screen stays stubbornly empty, black as the coffee growing cold in my hands. The silence in this apartment isn't just quiet, it's deafening. It echoes with conversations that never happen, with laughter that's moved on to other places, other lives. Sometimes I talk to myself just to hear a human voice, even if it's my own, cracked with age and disuse. Then one afternoon in November, as the autumn wind rattled my windows, I found it. A piece of paper on my kitchen counter, folded neatly in half. My daughter Jessica's handwriting, unmistakable after all these years of reading her school notes, her college applications, her wedding invitations. But this wasn't an invitation. It was the opposite. "Mom," the note read, "we decided it's better if you don't come to Lily's birthday party this weekend. Too many people. You know how you get overwhelmed. We'll send pictures. Lily." My 7-year-old granddaughter with the gap-toothed smile and wild curly hair just like her grandmother's used to be. The little girl who once begged me to read her stories and braid her hair. The child I hadn't seen in 3 months, despite living only 2 subway stops away in Fort Greene. I stood there holding that note, and something inside me cracked. Not broke. Cracked, like ice on a pond before it shatters completely. The sting of rejection brought back a flood of memories. Faded photographs tucked away in shoeboxes. The lingering scent of my late husband's tobacco pipe that still clung to his old sweater in the closet. The long nights I spent swallowing his harsh words and cruel silences just to keep peace in this house. That's when I realized the truth that had been growing inside me like a tumor for months. I had become invisible to the very people I had sacrificed everything for. But the story really begins 45 years ago, when I was 29 and thought I knew what love looked like. I met Richard at a diner in Queens where I was working double shifts, trying to save money for nursing school. He was handsome in that rough way that young women mistake for strength, with dark hair and eyes that promised adventure. He swept me off my feet with grand gestures and expensive dinners I later learned he couldn't afford. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at St. Augustine's Church in Park Slope. I wore my mother's dress, white lace yellowed with age but still beautiful. Richard promised me the world, and foolish as I was, I believed him. I dropped out of nursing school when Jessica was born, then again when Chris came 2 years later, and finally abandoned any dreams of a career when little Brian arrived when I was 35. Richard had big ideas, always talking about investments and business opportunities. He worked in construction, but he dreamed of owning his own company, making millions in real estate, building a fortune that would set us up for life. "Just wait, Helen," he'd say, using the nickname that once made me melt. "I'm going to make us rich. We'll have so much money, we'll never have to worry about anything again." But Richard's dreams were bigger than his abilities, and his temper was bigger than both. When his construction business failed after 3 years, he blamed everyone but himself. When his stock market investments went bad, he accused me of being unsupportive. When he started drinking heavily, he said it was because of the pressure I put on him to provide for the family. I remember the early years in our cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens. The walls were thin, painted a sickly green color that reminded me of hospital corridors. I gave everything I had, not just my paychecks from working at the diner and later as a secretary at an insurance company, but my very soul. I cleaned, cooked, patched up scraped knees and broken hearts, mediated fights between siblings, helped with homework until midnight. And yes, I forgave. I forgave Richard's drinking, his outbursts, his disappearances on payday when he'd come home with empty pockets and elaborate stories about bad luck at poker. The children were my world. Jessica, my serious little girl with the dark eyes who read books beyond her age and asked questions that made me proud. Chris, my athlete, tall and strong like his father, but with a gentleness Richard never possessed. And Brian, my baby, born when I thought I was too old for more children, sweet and sensitive and always clinging to my apron strings. I worked 2 jobs for 15 years, days at the insurance office, evenings and weekends cleaning offices downtown. My hands were always raw from bleach and disinfectant. My back ached from bending over toilets and scrubbing floors. But I told myself it was temporary. Just until Richard got back on his feet. Just until the children were older. Just until we could afford better. But temporary stretched into decades, and Richard's promises never materialized. Instead, his failures multiplied like weeds in an untended garden. He invested our meager savings in a friend's restaurant that closed after 6 months. He bought lottery tickets with the grocery money, convinced his luck was about to change. He started talking about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, downloading apps and charts, staying up all night studying something he called market analysis, but somehow always managing to lose whatever money he put in. "This is it, Helen," he'd say, showing me printouts of Bitcoin prices and stock charts I couldn't understand. "This is how we're going to make our fortune. Just look at these returns. We could be millionaires in a year." But millionaires we never became. Instead, we lived paycheck to paycheck while Richard chased dreams that always seemed to slip through his fingers like smoke. I was the anchor that held our family together during those turbulent years. When Jessica needed money for college, I worked extra shifts and sold my mother's jewelry. When Chris wanted to play baseball, I bought his equipment with money I'd saved by skipping lunches for 3 months. When Brian struggled with learning disabilities, I drove him to tutoring sessions after working 14-hour days, falling asleep in the car while waiting for him to finish. I never asked for gratitude. I never kept score. Love, I believed, wasn't a transaction. It was a gift you gave freely, without expecting anything in return. And I gave everything I had. Richard died of a heart attack when I was 58. Leaving me with a mountain of debt and 3 adult children who had grown accustomed to my sacrifices without ever acknowledging them. The life insurance policy we'd struggled to pay premiums on for 20 years had lapsed the month before he died. There was no inheritance, no nest egg, no reward for all those years of hard work and harder choices. But there was something else, something I discovered while going through Richard's papers after the funeral. bank statements showing withdrawals I knew nothing about, credit card bills for purchases I'd never made, and most crushing of all, a family investment account he'd opened without my knowledge, funded with money he'd taken from our household budget over the years. The account had been cleaned out just months before he died. The money transferred to an account I couldn't trace. Even in death, Richard had left me holding the bag for his failures. The children helped with the funeral expenses, but I noticed how they divided the costs among themselves, calculating their shares down to the penny. They didn't ask if I needed help with rent or groceries. They didn't offer to take over the bills that suddenly seemed insurmountable on my secretary's salary. They simply assumed I would manage, the way I always had. And I did manage. I worked until I was 68, saving every penny I could. I sold everything of value in the apartment: Richard's tools, my grandmother's china, even my engagement ring. I lived on pasta and peanut butter sandwiches, wore clothes from thrift stores, and never took a vacation or bought anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. By the time I retired, I had built up a small nest egg, not the vast fortune Richard had always dreamed of, but enough to pay my rent and buy groceries without lying awake at night worried about money. About $50,000 in savings, and a small pension from the insurance company. Not wealth by any measure, but security of a kind I'd never known. I thought my children would be proud of me. I thought they'd see how I'd managed to build something from nothing, how I'd survived and even thrived after their father's death. I thought they'd appreciate the woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to make theirs possible. I was wrong. The first time Jessica asked to borrow money, I didn't hesitate. She was going through a divorce, she said. Legal fees were expensive. She just needed a few thousand to get back on her feet. Of course I helped. She was my daughter, and she was hurting. The second time, it was Chris. His restaurant business was struggling, just a temporary cash flow problem. He'd pay me back with interest as soon as things turned around. I wrote him a check for $10,000 without thinking twice. Brian needed money for his daughter's medical bills. His own daughter, my granddaughter Lily, had some developmental delays and needed specialized therapy. How could I say no to that? But the loans never got repaid. The conversations about paying me back grew shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether. When I gently brought up the money, my children looked at me like I'd committed some kind of social crime. "Mom, we're family," Jessica would say. "You don't need to keep track of every penny." "It's not like you're struggling," Chris added. "You've got your pension and your savings. We're the ones with mortgages and kids in college." "You were always so generous before," Brian would say, managing to make liberality sound like an obligation rather than a choice. But what hurt most weren't the requests for money. It was the assumption that my money was somehow their money. That my years of sacrifice had earned me the privilege of continuing to sacrifice for their comfort and convenience. I started noticing the small things first. How they'd call only when they needed something. How visits became shorter and less frequent. How my opinions were dismissed with patronizing smiles and phrases like, "That's nice, Mom," or "You wouldn't understand." When I tried to share stories about my childhood or my marriage to their father, their eyes would glaze over. When I offered advice based on decades of experience, they'd change the subject. When I expressed interest in their lives, their jobs, their friends, their hopes and fears, they'd give me vague answers and look at their phones. I was becoming furniture in their lives. Useful furniture, to be sure, the kind of reliable, comfortable chair you take for granted until you need to sit down, but still, just furniture. The realization hit me one evening last spring, during what I thought was going to be a nice family dinner at Jessica's house in Fort Greene. She had invited me to celebrate her new job, and I was so excited to spend time with everyone. I brought homemade lasagna and a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. But as I sat at that dinner table, surrounded by my children and grandchildren, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my empty apartment. They talked around me, not to me. They discussed vacations they were planning, restaurants they wanted to try, movies they'd seen, all without asking if I'd like to join them or if I had any thoughts to share. I might as well have been invisible. After dinner, while I was washing dishes in Jessica's kitchen, because of course I was the one washing dishes, I overheard a conversation that stopped my heart. Chris was on the phone in the adjoining living room, his voice low but not quite low enough. "Yeah, she's here now," he was saying. "She brought that pasta thing again. I know, but we have to keep her happy. She's sitting on all that money, and we're going to need it eventually." The dish I was holding slipped from my hands and shattered on the kitchen floor. The sound seemed to echo through the house, and suddenly everyone was there, asking if I was okay, helping me clean up the broken pieces. But I wasn't okay. The dish could be replaced, but something inside me had broken that couldn't be fixed so easily. Keep her happy. Those words replayed in my mind during the entire subway ride home. She's sitting on all that money. As if my life's savings were some kind of trust fund they were waiting to inherit. As if my value as a mother and grandmother was measured entirely in dollars and cents. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked around my apartment, looking at the photographs on the walls, the memories scattered on tables and shelves, pictures of birthday parties and graduations, family vacations and holiday dinners. In every photo, I was there, cooking, cleaning, organizing, facilitating, making sure everyone else was happy and comfortable. When was the last time someone had asked me if I was happy? When was the last time anyone had tried to make me comfortable? I started paying closer attention after that, listening more carefully to what my children said and didn't say, watching how they interacted with me versus how they interacted with each other. And slowly, painfully, a pattern emerged. They had learned to see me as a resource rather than a person, someone who existed to meet their needs, solve their problems, and fund their dreams. And I had trained them to think this way through decades of selfless giving that had somehow become selfish taking. The nursing home conversation happened on a Tuesday in November. Jessica had called to say she was coming over with Chris to discuss something important. I made coffee and put out the good cookies, the expensive ones I usually saved for special occasions. I thought maybe they wanted to plan something nice for the holidays, or perhaps they'd finally decided to take me on one of those family vacations they were always talking about. Instead, they sat on my worn sofa and told me they'd been researching assisted living facilities. "It's not personal, Mom," Jessica said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use when they're explaining something to a child. "It's just that we worry about you living alone. What if you fell and couldn't get help? What if you forgot to turn off the stove or lock the door?" "You're not getting any younger," Chris added, "and we're all so busy with our own families and careers. We can't be checking on you all the time." "There are some really nice places in New Jersey," Jessica continued. "Clean, safe, with activities and people your own age. You'd make friends. You'd have someone to take care of you." I sat there listening to them plan my life as if I weren't in the room, as if my opinions and preferences didn't matter, as if the decision of where I'd spend my final years was theirs to make rather than mine. "What about my apartment?" I asked. "I've lived here for 37 years. "We'd sell it, of course," Chris said. "Real estate in Brooklyn is crazy right now. You'd probably get enough to pay for the nursing home for several years. My apartment, the place where I'd raised my children, grieved my husband, built my small but meaningful life. The walls that held decades of memories, the rooms that had witnessed my highest joys and deepest sorrows. They wanted to sell it like it was just another commodity, another asset to be liquidated for their convenience. "I don't want to live in New Jersey," I said quietly. "Mom, you haven't even seen the places we picked out," Jessica said. "At least look at the brochures." But I wasn't looking at the brochures. I was looking at my children's faces, trying to find some trace of the babies I'd rocked to sleep, the toddlers I'd taught to tie their shoes, the teenagers I'd waited up for on Friday nights. Where had those people gone? When had they been replaced by these strangers who spoke about my life in terms of convenience and cost? I'm not going to a nursing home, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. They exchanged glances, the kind of look parents give each other when their child is being unreasonable. Mom, you're being stubborn, Chris said. We're trying to do what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone, or what's best for you? The question hung in the air like smoke from Richard's old pipe. Jessica's face tightened, and Chris shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. That's not fair, Jessica said. We're thinking about your safety, your well-being. We love you. But as I looked at them sitting there in my living room, surrounded by the life I'd built with my own hands, I realized they didn't love me. Not the real me, anyway. They loved the idea of me, the memory of the mother who had always been there to clean up their messes and fund their dreams. They loved the woman who never said no, never asked questions, never put her own needs first. They had no idea who I really was underneath all that giving. Neither, I was beginning to realize, did I? After they left that night, promising to give me time to think about it as if my objections were just temporary resistance that would fade with proper conditioning, I sat in my empty apartment and tried to remember the last time I'd done something purely for myself. The last time I'd bought something I wanted rather than needed. The last time I'd made a decision based on what would make me happy rather than what would make someone else's life easier. I couldn't remember. That woman seemed to have disappeared somewhere along the way, buried under layers of duty and sacrifice. But if she was still in there somewhere, maybe it wasn't too late to find her again. The first thing I did was start paying attention to my phone. Not just checking for messages that never came, but looking at the patterns of when my children actually contacted me. It was always transactional, requests for money, demands for babysitting, obligations disguised as invitations. Can you watch Lily this weekend? We're going to the Hamptons with friends. Mom, can you lend me $2,000? I'll pay you back next month. They never did. We need you to make that potato salad for the church picnic. You make it better than anyone. Never just, how are you feeling? Or, what have you been up to? Or, would you like to have lunch? Always requests, always demands, always assuming my answer would be yes. So I decided to start saying no. It started small. When Jessica asked me to babysit Lily for an entire weekend so she could go to a spa retreat in the Catskills, I said I already had plans. I didn't, but that wasn't the point. The point was that my time had value, and I was under no obligation to donate it just because someone asked. What plans? Jessica demanded, as if I owed her an explanation. Personal plans, I said. When Chris called asking for money to cover his restaurant's rent, I told him I'd have to think about it. Then I didn't call back for 3 days. When I finally did call, I said no. I couldn't afford to lend him any more money right now. But Mom, I might lose the restaurant, he said. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied. Maybe the bank can help you. When Brian asked me to host Thanksgiving dinner for the entire extended family, 23 people, including his wife's relatives, I said it was too much for me this year. Someone else would have to take a turn. But you always do it, he protested. No one else knows how to make your stuffing. It's not that complicated, I said. I'll email you the recipe. Each no felt like swallowing glass at first. I'd been conditioned for decades to believe that my value lay in my usefulness, that love was something I had to earn through constant giving. Saying no felt selfish, cruel, unnatural. But I noticed something interesting. The world didn't end. My children didn't stop speaking to me. They couldn't afford to. They still needed things from me. They just had to adjust their expectations and learn to ask rather than demand. More importantly, I started to remember what it felt like to have boundaries, to own my own time and energy and money, to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what other people expected. For the first time in decades, I felt like a person rather than a service provider, but I also felt guilty. Late at night, I'd lie awake wondering if I was being too harsh, too selfish. Maybe they really did need my help. Maybe I was just bitter and resentful, taking out my frustrations on innocent children who only wanted what was best for their families. Then I'd remember Chris's words, "Keep her happy. She's sitting on all that money." And the guilt would transform into something harder and cleaner: determination. It was around Christmas time that I found the phone records. Jessica had left her phone on my kitchen table when she came by to drop off Lily after school. She'd rushed off to meet a client, promising to be back in an hour to pick up her daughter and her phone. Lily was in the living room, coloring pictures and chattering about her day, and the phone was just sitting there, occasionally lighting up with notifications. I wasn't planning to snoop. I'm not that kind of person. But when the phone buzzed for the 5th time in 10 minutes, I glanced at the screen out of habit. The notification showed a missed call from a number I didn't recognize, followed by 3 text messages from the same number. "Did you tell her about the place in Jersey? Make sure she signs the papers this week. The buyer is ready to move fast on the apartment." My hands started shaking as I read those messages. Buyer? What buyer? Without really thinking about what I was doing, I picked up the phone and scrolled through Jessica's recent calls. The same unfamiliar number appeared over and over again, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, often late at night after 10 o'clock. Calls that lasted 20, 30, sometimes 40 minutes. Who was my daughter talking to every single night? And why did the thought of finding out terrify me? I looked up the number online. The search results made my blood run cold. Brookside Manor Assisted Living Facility, New Jersey. Below that, a real estate agent's website advertising quick cash purchases of senior housing. They weren't just planning to put me in a nursing home. They'd already picked one out. They'd already been in contact with a real estate agent. They were making arrangements for my life without my knowledge or consent, as if I were a child or an invalid rather than a competent adult. But what horrified me even more was the realization that these conversations had been going on for months. All those nights when I'd been sitting alone in my apartment, missing my family, and wondering why they never called, Jessica had been on the phone with strangers, planning how to dispose of me and profit from the sale of my home. I heard Lily's voice from the living room, asking for juice, and I quickly put the phone back where Jessica had left it. But my mind was reeling. How long had this been going on? How many of these conversations had there been? What exactly had they promised the nursing home and the real estate agent? When Jessica came back an hour later, I watched her face carefully as she picked up her phone and checked her messages. She scrolled through them quickly, then looked up at me with what I now recognized as calculated sweetness. "Mom, I forgot to mention, Chris and I found another facility we'd like you to look at. It's really nice, and they have an opening next month. Would you like to see some pictures?" "No," I said quietly. "I wouldn't." She blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Don't you want to at least?" "No, Jessica. I don't want to see pictures of nursing homes. I don't want to discuss assisted living facilities. I don't want to move to New Jersey. I've told you this already." Her expression hardened slightly. "Mom, we've been trying to be patient with you, but you're not being reasonable. You can't live alone forever. What if something happens to you? What if something happens to me here, in my own home, surrounded by my own things and my own memories? What if I die peacefully in my own bed instead of in some sterile room in New Jersey, surrounded by strangers?" "That's morbid," she said, gathering Lily's things with sharp, angry movements. "We're trying to take care of you." "No," I said, my voice rising with an anger I'd kept buried for too long. "You're trying to take care of yourselves. You're trying to liquidate my assets and warehouse me somewhere convenient so you don't have to think about me anymore." Jessica's face went white. "That's not true. That's a terrible thing to say. Is it? Then explain to me why you've been talking to nursing homes and real estate agents without telling me. Explain to me why you're planning my future behind my back." For a moment, she looked genuinely shocked that I knew. Then her expression shifted to something I'd never seen before: cold calculation mixed with barely controlled fury. "You've been going through my phone?" she said, her voice dangerous. "You left it on my table. The messages were right there on the screen." "That's a violation of privacy, Mom. You had no right." "I had no right?" I stood up, my whole body trembling with 74 years of suppressed rage. "I had no right to know that my own daughter has been plotting to have me committed against my will? I had no right to know that you've been negotiating the sale of my home without my knowledge?" Lily started crying in the other room, scared by the sound of raised voices. Jessica rushed to comfort her, whispering soothing words and shooting looks at me that could have melted steel. "Look what you've done," she hissed. "You've upset Lily." But I was done being blamed for other people's discomfort, done being the villain in the story of my own life. "Get out," I said quietly. "What?" "Take your daughter and get out of my house. Don't come back until you're ready to treat me with the respect I deserve." Jessica gathered Lily and her things, muttering under her breath about ungrateful parents and how hard it was to help someone who didn't want to be helped. But I noticed she didn't deny what I'd accused her of. She didn't explain or apologize or promise to include me in future decisions about my own life. She just left, slamming my door behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. And for the first time in months, the silence in my apartment didn't feel oppressive. It felt like peace. But the peace didn't last long. Within hours, my phone started ringing. First Chris, then Brian, then Jessica again. All of them wanted to know what had happened, why I'd kicked Jessica out, why I was being so unreasonable. I didn't answer any of the calls. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about phone records and real estate agents and nursing homes in New Jersey. I thought about all the money I'd lent to my children over the years, money that was never repaid. I thought about all the times I'd said yes when I wanted to say no, all the ways I'd made myself smaller to make room for their needs and wants and demands. But mostly, I thought about the woman I used to be before I became a mother. The young woman who'd worked in Richard's diner, who'd dreamed of becoming a nurse, who'd believed she could change the world one patient at a time. Where had she gone? When had I stopped seeing myself as Helen and started seeing myself only as Mom? Maybe it wasn't too late to find her again. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I called in sick to my volunteer work at the church and took a mental health day. I made myself a nice breakfast, real eggs, not just toast and coffee, and sat by the window watching the world go by on Fifth Avenue. I watched young mothers pushing strollers, looking harried and exhausted in a way that brought back memories. I watched elderly couples walking hand in hand and felt a pang of grief for Richard despite everything. I watched teenagers cutting school, laughing and carefree, and remembered being that young once. When had I stopped watching the world? When had I become so focused on other people's needs that I'd forgotten to notice my own life happening around me? That afternoon, I walked to Prospect Park and sat on a bench near the lake. It was cold for December, the kind of crisp winter day that makes your cheeks ache but fills your lungs with clean, sharp air. I hadn't been to the park in years, even though it was less than 10 blocks from my apartment. I used to bring my children here when they were small. Jessica would feed the ducks while Chris climbed trees and Brian collected leaves for school projects. We'd spend entire Saturdays here, picnicking and playing games and just being together. When had we stopped doing things like that? When had family time become confined to holiday dinners and obligation visits? My phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Mom, Jessica told us what happened. Can we talk?" I turned the phone off and put it back in my purse. A young woman jogged past with a dog, both of them looking happy and alive in a way that made me envious. When was the last time I'd felt that kind of simple joy? When was the last time I'd moved my body just for the pleasure of movement, breathed air just for the pleasure of breathing? I decided to walk home instead of taking the bus. It took me an hour, and by the time I reached my building, my feet ached and I was out of breath. But I also felt more awake than I had in months, more present, more real. That evening, I made myself a proper dinner. Not just a sandwich or a bowl of soup, but a real meal with vegetables and protein and dessert. I set the table with my good dishes, lit a candle, and ate slowly while listening to jazz on the radio. It felt revolutionary. This simple act of caring for myself, of treating myself with the same kindness I'd spent decades lavishing on other people. After dinner, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. Then I realized that being alone in my own home, free from other people's demands and expectations, was special occasion enough. I drank the wine and looked through old photo albums, but this time I wasn't looking at pictures of my children or my late husband. I was looking for pictures of me. The young woman with the bright smile and hopeful eyes. The middle-aged woman trying to hold everything together. The older woman who'd gotten lost somewhere along the way. In every photo, I was there in the background, serving, cleaning, organizing, facilitating, making sure everyone else was comfortable and happy. But I couldn't find a single picture where I looked truly relaxed, truly content. In every image, even the happy ones, there was something strained around my eyes, something tired and resigned. I'd been disappearing, pixel by pixel, year by year, until I'd become invisible even to myself. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew what I had to do. First, I gathered up every piece of paperwork related to my finances: bank statements, insurance policies, investment accounts, Social Security documents. I spread them all out on my dining room table and really looked at what I had. It wasn't a fortune by anyone's standards, but it was more than I'd realized. The life insurance policy from my secretary job had accumulated some value over the years. My small pension, combined with Social Security, was enough to cover my basic expenses with a little left over. And my savings account, depleted by loans to my children, but still substantial, represented decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. This was my money. Money I'd earned through years of work, worry, and doing without. Money that represented my security, my independence, my ability to make choices about my own future. And my children were planning to take it all away from me. Next, I called my bank and asked about their financial planning services. I'd never thought I needed professional help managing my money. It wasn't complicated, and I'd been doing it myself for decades. But I realized I needed someone who could help me protect what I'd worked so hard to build. The financial advisor I met with was a kind woman named Maria, about Jessica's age but with genuine warmth in her eyes. She looked over my documents and asked about my goals for the money. Not my children's goals or my family's goals, but mine. I want to make sure no one can force me into a nursing home against my will, I told her. I want to know that this money will be there for my choices, not someone else's convenience. Maria nodded and made notes. We can set up some structures to protect your assets, she said. A trust maybe, or some restricted accounts. The important thing is making sure you maintain control while you're competent, and that your wishes are respected if you ever become unable to make decisions for yourself. My children won't like this, I said. It's not about what they like, Maria replied gently. It's about what you want. This is your money, Mrs. Patterson. You get to decide how it's used. For the next 2 weeks, I worked with Maria to restructure my finances. We set up a revocable trust that would protect my assets from being liquidated against my will. We established a healthcare directive that specified exactly what kind of care I wanted and didn't want. We even looked into home care services and modifications I could make to my apartment to age in place safely. I felt like a general preparing for battle. And maybe that's exactly what I was. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. On a snowy Thursday evening in January, all 3 of my children showed up at my door unannounced. They bustled in, shaking off snowflakes and commenting on the weather, acting as if nothing had happened between Jessica and me. We brought Chinese food, Chris announced, holding up bags from our old family restaurant. Thought we could have a nice dinner and talk. I let them in because I was curious to see what their strategy would be. We sat around my small dining table, passing containers of lo mein and sweet and sour pork, making small talk about work and weather. It was almost like old times, except for the tension humming under the surface like high-voltage wires. Finally, after we'd finished eating, Jessica cleared her throat. "Mom, we want to apologize for pressuring you about the assisted living situation," she said. "We realize we didn't handle it very well. We were just worried about you," Brian added. "Sometimes when you care about someone, you don't communicate in the best way. We should have included you more in the planning," Chris said. "Made sure you understood that we only want what's best for you." I listened to their carefully rehearsed words and recognized them for what they were: manipulation disguised as apology. They weren't sorry for treating me like a child. They were sorry they'd gotten caught. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" I asked. They exchanged glances, that same look they'd been giving each other since childhood when they were trying to get their stories straight. "For not communicating better," Jessica said. "For not including you in our discussions," Chris added. "For making you feel like your opinion doesn't matter," Brian said. "But you still think I should move to a nursing home?" Another round of glances. "We think you should consider all your options," Jessica said carefully. "And you still think you should be the ones making decisions about my living situation and my finances?" "Of course not," Chris said quickly. "But we are your children. We love you. And if something happened to you, we'd be the ones responsible for handling things." "Responsible for handling things," I repeated slowly. "You mean responsible for handling my money?" "That's not what he meant," Jessica said, but her voice was sharp. "Then what did he mean?" The masks were starting to slip. I could see the frustration in their faces, the irritation at having to maintain this pretense of caring concern. "Mom, you're twisting our words," Brian said. "We're trying to have an honest conversation here." "Are we?" "Because an honest conversation would involve you telling me about the nursing home you've already picked out, the real estate agent you've already contacted, the plans you've been making behind my back for months." The silence that followed was deafening. Chris shifted uncomfortably. Brian stared at his hands. Jessica's jaw clenched, and I could see her struggling to maintain control. "We were trying to be prepared," she said finally. "In case something happened to you. In case you changed your mind about staying here. Prepared or impatient." "That's not fair," Chris said. "Fair?" I stood up, and something in my voice made all three of them look up startled. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that I've spent 50 years sacrificing for this family, and now you can't wait to warehouse me in New Jersey and cash in on my apartment? Is it fair that you see me as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected?" "Nobody sees you as a burden," Brian protested. "Don't lie to me," I said quietly. I heard Chris on the phone. "Keep her happy. She's sitting on all that money." "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know what's been going on?" The room went dead quiet. I could hear the radiator hissing, the sound of traffic on the street below, the tick of the clock on my mantelpiece. My children sat frozen, caught in their own deception. "That's not what that meant," Chris said weakly. "Then explain to me what it meant." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No explanation came. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I've transferred my assets into a trust. You can't touch them without my permission, and you can't override my decisions about my living situation as long as I'm mentally competent. I've established a healthcare directive that specifies exactly what kind of care I want, and it doesn't include being shipped off to New Jersey against my will." Jessica's face had gone white. "You did what?" "I protected myself," I said simply. "The way I should have done years ago." "Mom, you can't just—" Chris was sputtering, unable to finish a sentence. "I can't what?" "Make decisions about my own money, plan my own future, act like a competent adult rather than a child who needs to be managed?" "But what if something happens to you?" Brian asked. "What if you need help? then I'll get help. Professional help, if necessary. But I'll make that decision when and if the time comes. Not now. Not based on your convenience and your plans for my apartment. I walked to my front closet and pulled out a manila envelope I'd prepared earlier. Inside were copies of all my new legal documents. The trust agreement, the healthcare directive, the power of attorney I'd assigned to a professional fiduciary rather than one of my children. This explains everything you need to know about my new arrangements, I said, handing the envelope to Jessica. You'll notice that you're no longer listed as my emergency contacts. You'll also notice that you have no access to my financial accounts or medical information unless I specifically authorize it. Jessica took the envelope with hands that were visibly shaking. Mom, this is extreme. We're your family. Family doesn't plot behind each other's backs, I said. Family doesn't hire real estate agents to sell someone's home without their knowledge. Family doesn't make plans for your future that ignore your wishes and serve their own interests. We were trying to help you, Chris said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, I said. You were trying to help yourselves. And I understand that. I understand that I've trained you to see me as someone who exists to solve your problems and fund your dreams. I understand that I've been an enabler, giving and giving until you learn to take and take without thinking twice about it. I sat back down at the table, my legs suddenly weak but my resolve still strong. But that stops now, I continued. I will no longer be giving anyone money without a written agreement and a payment plan. I will no longer be available for babysitting or emergency childcare unless you ask me politely and in advance, and I reserve the right to say no. And I will absolutely not be moving to any assisted living facility until and unless I decide that's what I want for myself. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. My children sat there staring at me like they'd never seen me before. And maybe they hadn't. Maybe they'd only ever seen the version of me that existed to serve their needs. What changed? Jessica asked finally. Why are you being like this? I started loving myself as much as I love you, I said. I started valuing my own happiness as much as I value yours. I started realizing that being a good mother doesn't mean being a doormat. But we need you, Brian said. And for the first time, his voice cracked with what might have been genuine emotion. No, I said gently. You need my bank account. You need my free babysitting. You need someone to blame for your problems and someone to bail you out of your mistakes. But you don't need me. You've made that very clear. Chris leaned forward in his chair. That's not true, Mom. We love you. I know you love me, I said. The way you love a favorite restaurant or a comfortable chair. Something reliable and familiar that's always there when you need it. But that's not the kind of love that sustains relationships, Chris. That's the kind of love that kills them. We sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, I could hear the sound of snow falling against my windows, the distant hum of the city settling in for the night. So what happens now? Jessica asked. Now you decide, I said. You can accept that I'm an adult human being with the right to make my own decisions, even if those decisions inconvenience you. You can learn to have a relationship with me that's based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. You can start seeing me as Helen instead of just Mom. Or, Chris asked, or you can keep trying to manipulate and control me, and we can become strangers who happen to share DNA, I said. It wasn't a threat. It was just a fact. I'd spent too many years being invisible to the people who were supposed to love me most. I wouldn't spend whatever years I had left being their victim. They left that night without saying much more. Jessica took the envelope of legal documents. Chris muttered something about needing time to process everything, and Brian gave me an awkward hug and said he'd call me soon. But as I watched them walk down my front steps into the snow, I realized I didn't much care whether they called or not. For the first time in decades, my happiness wasn't dependent on their approval or affection. I was free. The next few weeks were the loneliest I'd ever experienced, but also the most peaceful. My phone didn't ring constantly with requests and demands. No one dropped by unannounced expecting me to drop everything and cater to their needs. No one asked me for money or childcare or advice they had no intention of taking. It was just me in my apartment, learning how to be alone without being lonely. I started taking walks every morning, exploring neighborhoods in Brooklyn I'd lived near for decades but never really seen. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center and discovered I had a talent for painting cityscapes. I bought myself a comfortable reading chair and made my way through books I'd been meaning to read for years. I learned to cook for one person, making meals that I actually enjoyed instead of just whatever was cheapest and easiest. I rearranged my furniture to please myself rather than accommodate visitors. I bought new plants and put them in front of the windows where they could catch the morning sun. Slowly, carefully, I started building a life that was mine alone. But the real test came in March, when Lily, my granddaughter, had her 8th birthday party. I wasn't invited, of course, but Mrs. Miller, my neighbor, mentioned seeing Jessica carrying balloons and presents into her building, and I couldn't help thinking about the little girl with the curly hair who used to beg me to read her stories. I spent that entire Saturday wondering if Lily had asked where I was, wondering if anyone had explained to her why Grandma Helen wasn't there anymore, wondering if she missed me the way I missed her. That evening, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw a small figure standing in the hallway, holding what looked like a piece of paper. It was Lily. I opened the door quickly, looking past her for Jessica or Chris or Brian. But she was alone. "Hi, Grandma Helen," she said in her sweet, uncertain voice. "Mama said I couldn't invite you to my party, but I drew you a picture anyway." She held out a crayon drawing of what looked like 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "That's you and me," she explained. "I miss you." I knelt down to her level, my heart breaking and healing at the same time. "I miss you too, sweetheart. More than you know. Why don't you come to see us anymore?" she asked. "Did I do something bad?" "Oh, honey, no," I said, pulling her into a hug that smelled like birthday cake and childhood innocence. "You didn't do anything bad. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about things, and it makes everything complicated. I asked Mama if you could come to my party, but she said you were sick," Lily said. "Are you sick?" I thought about how to answer that. Was I sick? Maybe I had been sick. Sick with enabling, sick with self-sacrifice, sick with the disease of loving people who had learned to take my love for granted. "I'm feeling much better now," I said honestly. "Good," she said, and handed me the drawing. "This is for you. I made it special." After Lily left, her father Brian appeared in the hallway a few minutes later, looking embarrassed and sheepish. I taped her drawing to my refrigerator. It was the first decoration I'd put up since I'd reclaimed my space. That night, Brian called. "I'm sorry about Lily bothering you," he said. "She snuck out of the apartment while I was in the bathroom. She's been asking about you constantly." "She wasn't bothering me," I said. "She was being a loving granddaughter, something her father could learn from." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mom," Brian said finally, "I've been thinking about what you said, about how we've been treating you. And I think you might be right." "Might be?" "Are right," he corrected quickly. "I've been talking to Jennifer about it, and she thinks we've all taken you for granted. She wants to invite you to dinner next week. Just you and us and Lily. No agenda, no discussions about nursing homes or money. Just family dinner." It was the first genuine invitation I'd received in months, an invitation that didn't come with strings attached or hidden motives. "I'd like that," I said. "Really?" "Really. But Brian, if anyone starts pressuring me about my living situation or asking me for money, I'm leaving. Those conversations are over." "I understand," he said. "And Mom, thank you for not giving up on us completely. I know we don't deserve it. Everyone deserves a chance to do better, I said. But this is the only chance you're getting. The dinner with Brian's family went better than I expected. Jennifer had made pot roast, my favorite, and Lily had drawn me 3 more pictures to add to my refrigerator collection. We talked about normal things: Lily's school, Brian's job, a vacation they were planning to Cape Cod. Nobody asked me for money. Nobody suggested I was getting too old to live alone. Nobody treated me like a problem to be solved. For 2 hours, I felt like a welcome member of the family rather than a burden to be managed. But Jessica and Chris were a different story. Jessica called me a few days later, and I could hear the anger in her voice, even though she was trying to sound reasonable. "Brian told me you had dinner at his house," she said. "I think it's unfair that you're playing favorites." "I'm not playing favorites," I said. "I'm spending time with people who treat me with respect." "I treat you with respect," she protested. "Jessica, the last conversation we had, you accused me of violating your privacy because I saw text messages about selling my apartment. That's not respect. That's damage control." "I was upset," she said. "People say things when they're upset. And what about when you're not upset? When do you call just to see how I'm doing? When do you invite me to things because you want my company, not because you need my help?" She was quiet for a long moment. "It's complicated, Mom." "No, it's not," I said. "It's actually very simple. You either want a relationship with me, or you want my assets. You can't have both. That's not fair. You're making me choose between loving you and being practical about your future." "I'm making you choose between loving me and controlling me," I corrected. "If you truly loved me, you'd want me to be happy, even if my happiness didn't align with your convenience." "But what if you make bad decisions?" she asked. "What if you spend all your money on something stupid, or fall for a scam? Or, then those will be my mistakes to make," I said, "and my consequences to live with. That's what it means to be an adult, Jessica. You should try it sometime." She hung up on me. Chris took a different approach. He showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning with flowers and bagels from my favorite bakery. "Peace offering," he said with his most charming smile. "Can we start over?" I let him in because I was curious to see what his strategy would be. We sat at my kitchen table eating bagels and making small talk, and for a while it felt almost normal. Then he started talking about his restaurant. "Business has been really tough lately," he said. "The pandemic really hurt small places like mine." "I'm not asking for money," he added quickly when he saw my expression. "I'm just saying it's been hard." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "The thing is, I might have to close down if I can't make the rent this month. And Jennifer just found out she's pregnant, so Brian's going to have more expenses. And Jessica's been talking about going back to school to get her master's degree." He wasn't asking for money outright, but the message was clear. "Your children need help," he was saying. "How can you sit on all that cash while your family is struggling?" "Chris," I said gently, "what did I tell you about asking me for money?" "I'm not asking," he said. "I'm just explaining the situation." "You're manipulating," I said. "You're trying to make me feel guilty for not solving problems that aren't mine to solve." His face hardened slightly. "They are your problems, Mom. We're your children. When we hurt, you should hurt too. When you hurt because of circumstances beyond your control, I do hurt," I said. "When you hurt because of poor decisions or lack of planning, that's a you problem, not a me problem." "Jesus, Mom, when did you become so cold?" "I'm not cold," I said. "I'm boundaried. There's a difference." "Boundaried," he repeated mockingly. "Where did you learn that word? Some self-help book?" "I learned it from a therapist," I said. "Something you might want to look into." He left without finishing his bagel, muttering under his breath about ungrateful parents and family loyalty. But I didn't feel guilty anymore. I felt liberated. Over the next few months, I started building a life that felt authentically mine for the first time since I was 29 years old. I joined a book club at the library, where I met other women my age who had stories of their own. I volunteered at a literacy program, teaching adults to read. I even signed up for a senior travel group and took my first vacation in over a decade, a week in Asheville, North Carolina, where I hiked in the mountains and ate in restaurants where nobody knew me as someone's mother or grandmother. I was just Helen, a woman with her own interests, her own opinions, her own money to spend on her own pleasures. It felt revolutionary. But the final test of my transformation came in June, when Jessica called with what she clearly thought was devastating news. "Mom, I hope you're happy," she said, her voice bitter. "Chris's restaurant is closing. He's going to lose everything because of your selfishness." "I'm sorry to hear about Chris's restaurant," I said. "But my financial decisions didn't cause his business problems, and changing them wouldn't solve his business problems." "You could help him," she said. "You have the money." "I have my retirement security," I corrected. "Money I need for my own care as I age. Money I saved by working 2 jobs and doing without things I wanted so I could provide for my family." "We're still your family," she said. "Are we?" I asked. "Because family members don't try to institutionalize each other against their will. Family members don't sell each other's homes without permission. Family members don't call each other selfish for refusing to bankrupt themselves to fund other people's poor decisions." "Fine," Jessica said, her voice cold as winter wind. "If that's how you want it, fine. Don't come crying to us when you're old and sick and have nobody to take care of you." "I won't," I said calmly. "I'll hire professional caregivers with the money I didn't lend to ungrateful children." She hung up on me again. But this time, instead of feeling sad or guilty or worried that I'd lost my family, I felt something unexpected. Relief. I was free. Free from their demands, free from their manipulation, free from the exhausting job of trying to buy love from people who saw me as an ATM rather than a person. For the first time in decades, I belonged to myself. That evening, I sat on my small balcony overlooking the East River, watching the sunset paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and rose. The air was warm and soft, carrying the sounds of the city I'd lived in for decades but finally felt at home in. I thought about the young woman I'd been, full of dreams and hope, and the belief that she could make a difference in the world. She was still here, I realized, buried under decades of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing, but still here. Still alive. Still capable of dreaming. I pulled out my phone and called Mrs. Miller. "Elena," I said when she answered, "would you like to go to dinner tomorrow?" "My treat. I found a new restaurant I'd like to try." "I would love that, Helen," she said in her warm voice. "Should we invite anyone else?" "No," I said, surprising myself with how good that word felt. "Just us. Just 2 women having dinner because they enjoy each other's company." "Perfect," she said. After I hung up, I opened the bottle of wine I'd been saving for the right occasion. The sunset was spectacular. My book was waiting on the table beside me, and tomorrow I would have dinner with a friend who valued my company rather than my bank account. If this wasn't the right occasion, what was? As I sipped my wine and watched the lights come on across the river, I thought about everything I'd learned over the past year. About the difference between being loved and being used. About the difference between being generous and being enabling. About the difference between being alone and being lonely. I had spent 50 years being the mother who never said no, the wife who never complained, the woman who made herself smaller so everyone else could be bigger. I had confused self-sacrifice with love, martyrdom with virtue. But I was done with all that now. Done being invisible, done being taken for granted, done paying for affection that should have been freely given. At 74, I was finally learning how to be selfish. And it turns out, selfish doesn't mean cruel or uncaring. It means having a self to care for. It means recognizing that your needs and wants and dreams matter just as much as everyone else's. It means knowing that you don't have to earn love by bankrupting yourself financially or emotionally. 3 months later, in September, Brian called with an update. "Mom," he said, "I wanted you to know that Chris found a new job. He's managing someone else's restaurant now, and he seems happier, less stressed." "I'm glad to hear that," I said. "And Jessica's decided to wait on grad school. She's been going to therapy, actually, working on some issues. Good for her. She wanted me to ask if you'd be open to having coffee with her sometime. No agenda, no drama, just coffee." I thought about it for a moment. Jessica was still my daughter, despite everything. And people could change if they wanted to badly enough. "Tell her to call me," I said. "We'll see. And Mom, I wanted to thank you for standing up for yourself. I know it wasn't easy, and I know we didn't make it easy for you." "Thank you for saying that," I said. "Jennifer and I want to invite you to Lily's school play next month. She's playing a tree in the environmental awareness pageant. She specifically asked if Grandma Helen would be there." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. "Good. And Mom, we love you. The real you, not just what you can do for us. I hope you know that." "I'm starting to," I said. After we hung up, I looked around my apartment, my home, my sanctuary, my place in the world. The walls were painted a warm yellow now, a color I'd chosen because it made me happy. The furniture was arranged for my comfort and convenience, not to accommodate people who rarely visited. The bookshelves were full of books I'd actually read, the kitchen contained foods I actually enjoyed, and the closet held clothes that made me feel good when I wore them. This was what it felt like to live for yourself. Not selfishly, not cruelly, but authentically. Honestly. With boundaries and self-respect and the recognition that your own happiness matters. I was still a mother and grandmother. I would always be those things. But I was also Helen, a woman with her own interests and opinions and dreams. A woman who deserved to be treated with respect and kindness. A woman who didn't have to buy love or earn affection through constant giving. That night, I made myself a good dinner and ate it by candlelight while listening to jazz. I read a few chapters of a book I was enjoying, took a long bath with expensive bath salts I'd bought for no reason other than they smelled good, and went to bed early in sheets I'd chosen because they felt luxurious against my skin. It was a perfectly ordinary evening, and it was perfect because it was mine. All mine. To you who are listening to this story, I want you to know something. Your worth is not tied to what you can do for other people. Your value is not measured by your usefulness or your willingness to sacrifice for others. You are not a service provider or a bank account or a problem solver. You are a human being who deserves love and respect and kindness, simply because you exist. If you have been treated as invisible, as expendable, as someone whose needs and wants don't matter, then this story is for you. It's never too late to reclaim yourself. It's never too late to set boundaries. It's never too late to say no to people who take your love for granted, and yes to people who value your company for its own sake. It's never too late to stop being a doormat and start being a person. Have you ever lived something like what I've shared with you today? Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, taken for granted by the people who should love you most? Or maybe you know someone who has experienced this kind of quiet desperation, this slow erosion of self that happens when you give and give until there's nothing left? If any part of this story resonated with you, please share your experience in the comments below. Your story matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. And if this story helped you feel less alone, if it gave you courage to examine your own relationships and boundaries, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Together, we can remind each other that we all deserve to be seen, respected, and loved for who we are, not just for what we can provide. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me open my heart to you. And remember, you are never too old to start living for yourself.